Okay, picture this. It's 1919. The world is just staggering out of the single most brutal war in its history. We're talking millions dead, entire empires gone, and a whole generation of people just broken. So the number one question on literally everyone's mind was a huge one.
Right? How on earth do you make sure this kind of catastrophe never, ever happens again? This wasn't just some abstract political problem, it was this desperate global plea for a whole new way of running the world. And the answer they came up with was, well, it was a pretty radical new idea.
For the very first time, the world's leaders got together and seriously proposed creating an international group whose only job was to keep the peace. It was this incredibly hopeful, ambitious blueprint that was designed to completely change how countries dealt with each other. But, how is this thing actually supposed to work?
To really get it, we've got to break that blueprint down. So first, we'll look at the political setup that was supposed to stop wars. Then we'll get into some of the League's humanitarian work, which, honestly, is where you find some of its biggest successes. And finally, we'll get to the big one, the fatal flaw that basically doomed the entire project.
All right, first up, the political core. This was meant to be the engine of the whole machine, the part designed to prevent conflict. Now, if you're revising for exams, this is the part you really need to lock in. The simplest way to think about it is like a kind of new global government.
So you had the Assembly, which was kind of like a world parliament. Every single member country got a vote. That sounds super fair, right? But man, it could be incredibly slow. So for the big, urgent stuff, you had the Council. This was a much smaller group of the most powerful nations, acting like an executive committee to make quick decisions. And then you had the Secretariat, which was the civil service that did all the admin and kept the lights on. And to complete the set, there was the Permanent Court of International Justice. This was the legal side of things, meant to settle arguments between countries based on the law. So you've got a parliament, a cabinet, a civil service, and a Supreme Court. On paper, it actually looks pretty solid, doesn't it? But the League wanted to do so much more than just politics.
Yeah, because the vision here wasn't just about stopping bad things from happening. It was also about actively making the world a better place, tackling some of the biggest social problems around through a whole network of special groups, or commissions.
And this is where we see some of the League's most amazing and often forgotten successes. We're going to focus on three big ones: workers' rights, the fight to end slavery, and the absolutely massive refugee crisis after the war. Now, to understand how these commissions actually got anything done, you need to know this key term, convention. See, they couldn't just pass laws that everyone had to follow. Instead, they created these international agreements, conventions, that countries would hopefully, agree to follow out of a sense of doing the right thing. And the International Labor Organization, or ILO, was brilliant at this.
I mean, just think about that for a second. Basic ideas that so many of us take for granted today, like an 8-hour workday or rules against child labor, these were pushed onto the world stage by the ILO. They managed to persuade countries all over the globe to adopt these standards, which made life better for millions and millions of people.
But they didn't stop there. The Slavery Commission had an even bigger goal: to eradicate slavery. Not just reduce it, but to get rid of it completely. And this was a huge problem back in the early 20th century.
And they really made a dent. Just by putting a global spotlight on the issue and pressuring governments that were turning a blind eye, they helped free thousands of people. They got real commitments from countries in Africa and Asia to finally outlaw the practice for good.
But honestly, maybe the most powerful, most incredible example of what the League could do came from its work with refugees. After World War I, Europe was a mess. Millions of people were displaced, including hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war who were just stuck miles from home. The job of getting them back seemed flat out impossible.
So, what's this number? 423,000. This is what the League's work looked like in human terms. It's one statistic that tells a really powerful story.
That's how many prisoners of war the League's Commission for Refugees managed to get home to their families. An absolutely incredible achievement. So you look at all these successes, and you have to ask, why on earth is the League mostly remembered as a failure? And that brings us to it. The fatal flaw, the huge crack in the blueprint. Because for all the amazing humanitarian work it was doing, the League's political core, its main job, had a massive, critical weakness.
This cartoon from 1920 just sums it up perfectly. You've got this tiny, harmless rabbit, that's the League, trying to face down this enormous, deadly snake, which represents war. And what's the rabbit's only weapon? The power of my eye.
And that was it.
That was the League's only real weapon, moral persuasion. The whole idea was that no country would want to be publicly shamed and condemned by the rest of the world, so just the threat of being called out was supposed to be enough to keep aggressive countries in line. The entire plan was built on hope, the hope that everyone would just play nice.
And there it is. That's the fatal flaw. Because what happens when a bully doesn't care about being told off? What happens when a powerful country decides to just ignore the rules? Without an army of its own to actually enforce its decisions, the League was completely powerless.
So how do we square this? How do we balance these two very different pictures of the League of Nations? Let's put the blueprint right next to the reality and come to a final verdict.
So on one side, you've got the blueprint's clear successes, helping refugees, improving working conditions, fighting slavery, real, tangible good in the world. But on the other side, you've got the harsh reality. It had no army. It relied on moral persuasion. Its decisions weren't legally binding. And maybe the biggest nail in the coffin? The USA, the country that came up with the idea, never even joined. That just crippled its authority right from the start.
And that leaves us with the big question, the one that historians and students have debated ever since. Was the League of Nations a noble failure, a brilliant idea that was just ahead of its time, or was the blueprint itself just too flawed, too naive, and doomed to fail from the very beginning? That's the verdict you have to decide.